Okay, well, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Professor Adolfo Martin García. Professor García is interested in neurolinguistics and translation. He's Professor of Translation Theory at the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba in Argentina, and a researcher in the, I'm saying this in English rather than Spanish, National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. He's participated in research projects in bilingualism and translation in Argentina and the USA. He's published over 30 papers and book chapters focusing mainly on the neural representation of language, translation theory, bilingualism, and epistemological aspects of linguistic theory. He's edited 2 books on empirical linguistics, and last year he published a book, Translation and Neurolinguistics. Sorry, I can't read my own writing. Neurocognition. Translation and Neurocognition. He's also translated 2 books into Spanish. One of them, Professor Robin Fawcett's Invitation to Systemic Functional Linguistics, and also Professor Sidney Lamb's Pathways of the Brain. So I'd like to welcome Professor García and hand over straight away.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for your kind presentation. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Webster for inviting me to participate in this wonderful academic endeavor. And also thank you to all the organizers of the symposium for your very warm and diligent welcome to Beijing. So I'm going to be talking about the neurocognitive determinants of variability in the representation, processing, and use of English as a world language. So this is actually going to be a slightly different perspective from what we've been listening to yesterday and just now. So what I propose is to offer you a look within the user of English as a world language. So my perspective is that of neurolinguistics, that is to say an interdisciplinary field which tries to study and explore the organization and functioning of linguistic systems in relation to their biological substrates, namely the brain. And my point of departure today is the following one. We are here at the Journal of World Languages Launch Symposium, and here in this room we have people coming from all over the world, and we are all using English. We are all communicating in English, which is, by the way, not the mother tongue of the majority of the people here, myself included. And we have acquired or learned English differently, and we use English differently. However, we have something similar, which is the fact that we all store the knowledge that we have of English, whatever it is, in our brains. That is a fact, an undisputed fact by now. And all of our brains, although each of us has a very unique individual brain, is remarkably similar. Just as our bodies, although we don't have the same faces, and our arms are not exactly the same, and our hands are not exactly the same, are, in general terms, they follow the same plan, if you will. Yeah, we all have one head situated in the middle of our body and 2 symmetrical legs and arms. So the same applies for our brains. My question, given these observations, is the following one. What is the role of the brain in that variability that we have, in the way in which we have appropriated the knowledge that we have of English and the way in which we use and process English? So, as I said before, I propose a look within the user of English as a world language. And this is an interdisciplinary endeavor. I am a firm believer in the benefits of interdisciplinary pursuits in academic questions. And so the proposal here is to try to address this construct of world languages from a neurocognitive and neurolinguistic perspective. These are exciting times for brain research in general and neurolinguistics in particular. We have learned more about the brain in the last 60 years mainly due to the development of great neuroimaging techniques, than we have in the rest of human history altogether. And just to give you an idea of the momentum that brain research is experiencing right now, there are massive investments that have been made only recently throughout the world. President Barack Obama in the United States launched an initiative known as the Brain Mapping Project. The idea is to have the first complete mapping of a whole human brain, and he has devoted $100 million American to that task. And also, this is very fresh news, this happened only a few months ago, the Human Brain Project, which will last 10 years, and it just was launched now, was approved by the European Commission, this flagship project, and it's going to involve roughly 1.2 billion euros involving over 80 research centers the world over. So we are going to be learning a lot about the brain in upcoming years. And my idea is, well, why not try to jump on board that fascinating boat and see whether we can use some of that imminent data and the data that we already have to try to elucidate this topic of world languages and languages in general. I'm going to be focusing on English as a case in question today. And, well, we all know this by now. English is, as a world language, is spoken by a significant proportion of individuals the world over. It plays a dominant role in international media, institutional and diplomatic communications. And this is another aspect that I'm going to be highlighting today, which is the fact that most users of English are non-native speakers. This small random sample that we have right here in this room attests to this point. So bilingualism will be a key notion in this presentation, but this is not a term without multiple definitions in the literature. So I'd like to make explicit what it is that I understand by a bilingual here. So for present purposes, I will conceive of a bilingual as any person who uses at least 2 languages or dialects in daily life, who can willingly communicate in one or the other according to the circumstances, and who can do so at any level of proficiency as long as he can fulfill his communicative goals. This is, if you will, a maximally inclusive definition of bilingualism, and which is, by the way, in keeping with mainstream definitions in psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics. The references here are only some of the scholars who subscribe to this conception. Thus defined, bilinguals have been estimated to amount to approximately 50 to roughly 66 and to as much as 75% of the world population, which means that bilingualism, in spite of the treatment of bilingualism in the literature, is the rule rather than the exception. This is something that happens in linguistics, but most linguistics theories, they take the model of a monolingual, unilingual speakers, and in fact that is actually the most atypical situation in our society. Arguably because of the prominence of bilingualism in world languages, one of the defining features of a world language, and this is true I believe of English at the very least, is that there is marked inter-user performance variability. That is to say, the range of variation in the way in which what we might presume is one and the same language, English, is used by different speakers is remarkable. And this has been acknowledged as a hallmark of world languages. And this topic, inter-user performance variability, has been studied from several perspectives with a focus on English. And the perspectives include political, grammatical, phonological, dialectal, curricular, pedagogical, and otherwise theoretical approaches. However, in my own appraisal of the literature, what I have noticed is that there is a dearth of studies examining the neurocognitive basis of the phenomenon. So with that in mind, my goal today is to try to specify some of the neurocognitive determinants of performance variability among world language users, and I'll be making special reference to English-speaking bilinguals. And the procedure by which I intend to accomplish this perhaps way too ambitious goal is to provide you with a selective review of the evidence and to illustrate each of the factors involved by reference to 2 or 3 studies that target critical variables. The very first thing I'd like to do is to make a brief reference to English and the representation of English in our brain as a native language. And the first point to make here, I believe, is that, as everybody here, I assume, knows, language is not a monolithic entity. It is not just one unified whole. Rather, and this is something that we have learned thanks to the fantastic work of Professor Halliday here, can be better conceived as a system of systems, a collection of interrelated systems. And this claim is no less true when it comes to thinking about the neurological organization of languages. And there are many distinctions that we could make in terms of how the brain organizes and treats linguistic information, but for this presentation I would just like to focus on one key distinction, which is that of the involvement of procedural versus declarative memory in the representation and processing of a native language. This is an association that is very, very well established in the neuropsychological literature. And basically, there is an abundance of evidence that shows that in our brains, we have 2 different memory systems. The first one is the procedural memory system, whose critical substrates are the basal ganglia, subcortically, and aspects of the inferior frontal lobe, neocortically. So let's refer to all that as the frontal part. Yeah, and this memory system is in charge of representing and processing information that has been acquired incidentally, without paying conscious attention to the physical form of the stimuli. The information that is processed by this memory system is treated in an automatic fashion. It is processed below the threshold of conscious attention. It is all the things that we do, but we are not consciously thinking about doing them. So, for example, when you tie your shoes, you're not consciously thinking, okay, now I have this shoelace and I'm going to put the other one on top, and now you just do it. Maybe at the very first stages you had to declaratively think about that, but there came a time when you automatized those processes. And when automatization came in, it is procedural memory that's actually acting. On the other hand, the declarative memory system is represented in more posterior, mainly temporal brain areas. So let's refer to that as the posterior part. Yeah, we're not going to go into the most cumbersome neuroanatomical details. And this memory system is in charge of representing and processing information that we can consciously evoke, that we can have conscious control over, and that we can declare. I mean, we are aware, we can describe with whatever terminology we have available what we know about that information. So why is this important? Because there is a very well established correlation between these 2 memory systems and different aspects of language, in particular grammatical functions. And by grammar here I am including syntax and compositional morphology. It's a function of language that is processed and represented in procedural memory circuits. Think about the case of the 5-year-old who is all of a sudden perfectly engaging in the grammatical life of language. Let's say he's perfectly constructing, I don't know, subject-verb agreement, and he uses passive and active voices, but he has no conscious knowledge of what he's doing, yet he does it perfectly. And if you ask him, okay, why did you pluralize the verb here? He would have no resources to say why he did that. That is procedural memory at work. However, what we might call vocabulary, and here, at least in the psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic literature, this subsumes both knowledge of word forms and the associated semantic features, is represented in declarative memory circuits. And the evidence that we have for this comes from neuroimaging studies, clinical studies, and so on and so forth. So the first point here is that when we try to discuss the neurological underpinnings of language, it is a mistake to speak of language without making reference to which subsystem we are actually addressing. And the second thing is that because of the nature of the information that they process, procedural information is actually features negligible variation both within and across subjects. However, there is a much wider range of variability in the processing, representation, and use of declarative information, vocabulary. So I wanted to introduce this by reference to English as a native language, because these are concepts that we're going to be constantly bouncing back to, as it were. Now, my focus, as I said, is going to be on bilingualism. And the very first thing I'd like to point out is that bilingualism modulates cognitive processing. What I mean is that the way in which the mind and or brain of a bilingual person treats the information is not the same as what you have in a monolingual person. The main sources of evidence for this claim come from the wonderful work of Ellen Bialystok, and what she has shown in over 20 years of research is that bilingual users of English as a world language, as either an L1 or an L2, have, relative to monolingual speakers, better selective attention, problem-solving skills, meta-linguistic awareness, inhibitory control, and executive processing at large. So there's a bilingual advantage for these non-linguistically exclusive functions. However, bilinguals, as compared to monolinguals, are at a disadvantage when it comes to word retrieval speed, lexical fluency, and vocabulary density. That is to say, bilinguals take longer to access the words, they have reduced vocabularies relative to monolinguals, and this is valid for both the bilinguals L1 and L2. So here we have another source of performance variability. It's not just whether you speak English or you don't. The point here is whether you are a monolingual or a bilingual user of English, and that will have a bearing on how you process at least vocabulary-related information. Let me just give you a sample of the evidence behind this claim. This is a figure that I took from one of Ellen Bialystok's papers. This is a research that she conducted with her team in 2010, and what she did here was to administer a very well-known receptive vocabulary test, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, to a sample of roughly over 1,700 subjects, including monolinguals and bilinguals. The test was conducted exclusively in English. And what you have here is the mean scores obtained by the groups. The bold line on top represents the mean scores obtained by monolinguals, and the dotted line at the bottom, the mean scores obtained by the bilingual subjects. And what you can see is that all across the different age groups, starting at 3 and going all the way up to 10 years of age, the monolinguals consistently have an advantage. That is to say, bilinguals have, let's say, a reduced lexical repertoire in English as compared to monolingual speakers. So here we have a first source of inter-user performance variability in English. Bilingualism. But that was behavioral evidence, and here we are concerned with the neurological mechanisms. And in fact, the neurocognitive mechanisms for processing language are different between L2s and L1s. That's, by the way, that's me, and the poor victim that you can see there is my fiancée, who was, what she has on her head is actually a set of 128 electrodes that I used to explore her language processing. So I did what most men in the world have always wanted to do, but never actually succeeded, which is to learn what is going on inside your girlfriend's head. So this is a technique known as ERP, Evoke Response Potentials. And what this gives you is an idea of how, of the time course of information flow in the brain. And a main finding here concerning bilingualism is that bilinguals, if you compare them to monolingual speakers, they have delayed latencies in the semantic sensitive N400 components. In layman terms, what this means is that the neural signals that are responsible for activating semantic information in lexical tasks are slower in the bilingual relative to the monolingual brain. There you have another source of performance variability. And also from fMRI studies, and this is a resonator you might identify if you see American shows such as House, MD, and things like that. What these technologies do, they give you great spatial information. They have great spatial resolution, so they are well suited to answer questions regarding where in the brain things are happening. And something that was discovered thanks to these technologies, is that L1 activations are similar across participants, across different subjects' brains, but L2 activations are varied and inconsistent. And let me just give you an example of this. This is a classic study in the neurolinguistics literature conducted by Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues in '97. So what they did was they formed a group of French-English bilinguals, and they administered story listening tasks to them. First in L1, then in L2, and then in a language that was unknown to the participants as a control condition. And what was observed when they compared the areas that were activated in the different subjects' brains was that the areas that were engaged in the L1 condition were consistent, similar across all the subjects. That is to say, the brains of different subjects use the same neural mechanisms and resources to process linguistic information in L1. However, when they compared the areas that were activated when the story was listened in L2, the activations were inconsistent and quite varying across participants. And they actually involved frontal and posterior regions in both hemispheres as relative to the left-sided activations of the L1 group. So what this means is that one and the same language will actually engage different resources for different people depending on whether it is an L1 or an L2. And an L2 will rely on different neural mechanisms depending on the subject, but that doesn't happen with an L1. So here you have yet another source of inter-user performance variability differences, if you will. In the case of late language learners, and I will come back to the notion of late language learner afterwards, several intersubjective differences relate to their increased reliance on declarative memory, which may be used to process not just lexicosemantic, but also grammatical information. And I'll be quoting one of my mentors, Michel Paradis here, who stated that the use of declarative memory to learn a second language leads to inter-individual variability in ultimate attainment, resulting from differences in working memory capacity, level of education, IQ, motivation, and other factors that do not affect first language acquisition. In my own overview of the literature, I have noticed that there are three main factors that underlie performance differences among non-native users of English as a world language, in neurological terms I mean, namely age of acquisition, level of proficiency, and the degree of formal similarity between the L1 and the L2. So let us tackle each of these factors in turn. First, the age of acquisition factor. And here we are concerned with the difference between early versus late non-native users. Starting in 1967, thanks to the work of Lenneberg, there is this hypothesis that became very popular, which is the so-called critical period hypothesis. It was actually an extrapolation from studies in ethology. The original hypothesis was that there was a critical period for incidental acquisition of linguistic information that was estimated to, let's say, to oscillate around puberty. Now, the idea that it was a critical period is correct, but puberty is not the right time closure for it. And recent evidence has suggested, I even want to say demonstrated, that there is the optimal window for incidental acquisition through procedural memory circuits of linguistic information closes roughly around ages 5 through 7, not after that. How do we know this? Well, this is the time span at which procedural memory circuits begin to lose plasticity, whereas declarative memory begins to improve steadily, and maintains a path of steady enhancement all the way throughout adulthood. And this is arguably due to the increase of estrogen levels during adulthood and adolescence, given that this substance inhibits procedural memory while enhancing declarative memory. There is some linguistic evidence, well, there's actually a lot of linguistic evidence, but I just have here a few samples of it. Birdsong, in 1999, he conducted a critical literature review, and he showed that in languages that are appropriated after late childhood, grammatical skills are poorer than lexical abilities. And this is something that we probably have witnessed in our own, contact with non-native speakers. In early bilinguals, this is a study by Murring, gender agreement rules are easily acquired before age 3, but they become progressively harder afterwards. And it was also Birdsong who showed that in most tasks in which L2 performance is comparable to L1, well, these are offline tasks, meaning that they allow for conscious control via declarative and executive processes. Now, a leading hypothesis regarding the role of age of acquisition in terms of the neural representation of languages comes from the so-called declarative procedural model of bilingualism, which was first developed by Michel Paradis and then further developed by Michael Ullman. And the key proposal of this model is that if an L2, English, let's say, if an L2 is acquired at an early age, that is to say before that optimal window of opportunity closes, then the distribution of grammatical subsystems in that L2 will resemble that of their counterparts in a native language. So the grammar will be subserved by procedural memory, whereas lexicosemantics will be declarative. However, if the non-native language is appropriated at a late age, after age 7, let's say, then both grammar and lexicosemantics will be represented and processed in declarative memory, meaning that they will be subject to more conscious, less automatic neural mechanisms. Some of the evidence behind this claim. This is clinical evidence. Aladdin and colleagues in 2008, they set out to study the linguistic performance of 2 late Ukrainian English bilinguals. They were late bilinguals. And they were epileptics, and their epileptogenesis, the focus was in their temporal lobe, a critical substrate of declarative memory. So what happened for roughly 20 to 30 minutes post-seizure was that these subjects will become completely unable to engage in grammatically sound, spontaneous production in L2, but not so in L1. This is consistent with the dissociation I just pointed out, given that they were late bilinguals. Now, what happens when a late bilingual sustains lesions not to his declarative memory, but to his procedural memory? This is a very revealing study. It's actually a review of 4 case studies conducted by Fabro and Paradis in '95 for late bilinguals, and all of them had sustained fronto-basal lesions. That is to say, their procedural memory had been compromised. And what was observed in this case was that their L1 grammar was greatly impaired, but not their L2 grammar skills, which is consistent with the idea that a late learner will represent grammatical information of his L2 in declarative memory circuits, which were spared in this case. There's also neuroimaging evidence that is consistent with this claim. Another classic study by Chi and colleagues, they studied they formed a group of early Chinese English bilinguals. They were early bilinguals. Remember that the idea with early bilinguals is that the distribution of the linguistic subsystems of L1 and L2 will be the same, or very similar. And they asked the subjects to decide whether sentences in either language are true or false. This is a task that taxes grammatical processing, because part of what you need to do to determine whether a sentence is true or false is to parse it. So that taxes the grammatical system. And what was observed was that the task led to almost identical activation in both languages. So you can see the caption here. The overlapping areas here are drastically much more prevalent than the differential areas engaged by one but not the other language. So again, this is consistent with the dissociation proposed by the model. And more recent evidence, this is a study by Waldron and Hernandez, published just a few months ago. This is very interesting. What they did was to compare directly one group of early Spanish-English bilinguals with another group of late Spanish-English bilinguals. And the task consisted in covertly, that is to say silently, generating the past tense form of L2 verbs. The task was conducted entirely in English. So there were many results in this study. But the one that I want to point out now is that in the early group, the differential areas for the same task with the same linguistic stimuli in the same language, in English, engaged frontal temporal regions associated with automatic processes. However, the same task with the same stimuli in the same language, English, in the late group, engaged differentially posterior and prefrontal areas associated to controlled processes. So the bottom line here is that the age at which you appropriate a non-native language, English in this case, determines which neural mechanisms will be devoted to processing what is essentially the same type of linguistic information. The second factor is the LOP factor, the level of proficiency factor. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that, this is behavioral evidence, that shows that translation asymmetries, asymmetrical switching costs, that is to say the time it takes you to switch from L1 into L2 versus the time it takes you to switch from L2 into L1, they are different. And also differences in conceptual involvement between L1 and L2 tasks are greater in low proficiency than in high proficiency bilinguals. But what about the neural implications of this? A leading hypothesis, well, actually the fact is that level of proficiency has an impact on the neurological representation of languages. And a leading view in this sense is the so-called convergence hypothesis, which posits that as proficiency in L2 increases, the representation of L2 and its processing profile, that is to say ERP and neuroimaging data, converge with those of native speakers of that language. That is, any qualitative differences between native speakers of a language and L2 speakers of that language disappear as proficiency increases, even in neurological terms. Perani and colleagues in '98, they compared two groups, again, one made of early and the other one made of late bilinguals, but this time the group matched both groups for LOP. So they differed in their age of acquisition, but they were all highly proficient, and there were no significant differences between their level of proficiency. So the subjects had to listen to stories in L1 and L2. A task, actually, it was a replication of the task I mentioned before. And what was observed here, you might remember that there were differential areas previously, but here, the activations between languages were similar in both groups, engaging mainly temporal and hippocampal areas. What this suggests is that a high level of proficiency attenuates the age of acquisition-based differences in the neurocognitive representation of languages. The higher a level of proficiency, a change in your level of proficiency will also change which neural substrates are dedicated to processing the same type of linguistic information. Videso and colleagues in 2010, this is a very interesting study too, they worked with trilingual speakers. They were native speakers of Latin, that's a language spoken in southern Italy, and these subjects were also highly proficient in their L2, Italian, but they had a low level of proficiency in their L3, English. And they asked them to perform a picture naming task. The subjects were shown pictures and they had to name them in all three languages. But what was observed was that there were common brain areas for all languages, but that L1 and L2, that is to say the high proficiency languages, involved enhanced right prefrontal activity as compared to L3. A conclusion that the authors propose is that the prefrontal cortex then may support language proficiency by supervising effective word retrieval. But what it means also for present purposes is that the level of proficiency that you have in a non-native language will also determine which brain areas are involved to process lexical information. So it's not just a matter of whether the language is native or non-native, but also how proficient you are will determine which neural mechanisms are brought into what is essentially one and the same task. And then Moreno and Cutas in 2005, they showed that also the level of proficiency of a language, if a low proficiency speaker as compared to a high proficiency speaker takes longer to access semantic information. That's basically, I don't want to spend much time discussing this. So this attests not to which brain areas are involved, but actually to the speed at which neurophysiological signals are transmitted as we process linguistic information. So again, LOP affects this aspect of language processing too. So the take-home message here is that level of proficiency modulates the neural representation and the electrophysiological processing of non-native languages, world languages, English in our case. And the final aspect I want to discuss today is what I call the interlinguistic factor. In bilinguals, a world language, English, that is represented as either a native or a non-native language may also be processed differently depending on specific properties of the other language. Languages interact in our brains. A very, very, very interesting study by Young and colleagues. They set out to study the neural distribution of nouns and verbs in late Chinese English bilinguals. But let me give you some background before I discuss the main result of this study. There's a lot of evidence dating from the early 90s that shows that in monolingual English speakers, nouns and verbs are processed and represented in different brain areas. Mainly verbs are represented in frontal brain areas and nouns in posterior brain areas. That is to say, there are different neural mechanisms that are involved in the representation and processing of different lexical classes. Now, in Chinese, no such dissociation occurs. It is not the case that the brain of a Chinese monolingual speaker has different neural areas devoted to processing different lexical classes. There is no such difference. In a previous study conducted with early Chinese English bilinguals, it was shown that each language presented the same profile as what you find in monolingual speakers. So in an early Chinese English bilinguals, the Chinese verbs and nouns are subserved by one and the same neural substrate, but in English, they are subserved by different neural substrates. Now, in this case, Young and colleagues, they studied the performance of late Chinese English bilinguals. And this is, I find this fascinating. What they observed was that nouns and verbs in both languages are subserved by largely overlapping regions. So unlike the native English speakers, and even the Western learners of English, these subjects, late Chinese English bilinguals, showed no neural dissociation between nouns and verbs in English. These are some of the actual images. We can skip them, but this is, I believe, this is very well put by the authors. One of their main conclusions is that these late bilinguals may be applying the neural mechanism for Chinese, their L1, to the processing of English, their L2, and hence also show no neural sensitivity to nouns versus verbs in English. In other words, the way in which your brain will be tuned to process certain lexical information, even grammatical information of English, will depend on how the mother tongue has, let's say, taught the brain to establish a similar difference. Another piece of evidence that shows that how you represent and process one language depends on how you treat the other language, or depends on the other language generally, is the so-called cognate effect. Are you familiar with this effect? Basically, formal similarities between a native language and a non-native world language also influence lexical processing in the latter. The cognate effect could be defined as the empirical finding that cognates are processed faster than non-cognates. There is a lot of behavioral evidence behind this. And a particularly interesting study is the one that Dijkstra and colleagues conducted. They tested Dutch-English bilinguals in an all-English task, in an all-L2 task. It was an English lexical decision task. Basically, the subjects were shown strings of letters, and they had to decide whether they constituted words or not in English. What was observed was that the words that were cognates relative to the tacit Dutch counterparts were recognized significantly faster than those which were not. So the cognate facilitation effect was observed. But this is very interesting. The cognate facilitation effects were proportional to the degree of orthographic overlap between equivalents. What does this mean? Reaction times decreased as formal similarity increased across counterparts. So, for example, it took the subjects they were much faster at recognizing the English word lamp, which is the full cognate relative to the tacit Dutch counterpart lamp, than it took them to recognize the word flood, which is a partial cognate relative to the VLOED, flood in Dutch, which in turn, flood was recognized significantly faster than the words such as song, which are non-cognates in this case relative to the tacit Dutch counterpart lead. So this warrants the conclusion that the greater the degree of formal overlap between the English and the native language lexicons, the greater facilitatory effects will tend to be in the former during specific language processes. The cognitive facilitation effect is generally larger in L2s than in L1s, but it also affects L1 processing. And this is a question that I set to study myself with my own research team in our lab in Buenos Aires. So we already have the results. We are wrapping up the manuscript for submission shortly, I hope. But what we did here was we were interested in seeing whether the cognitive effect works irrespective of language proficiency and whether the languages were native or non-native. So what we did was to form groups of Spanish-English bilinguals on the one hand, and then English-Spanish bilinguals. And we administered several lexical processing tasks, mainly word reading and word translation. So we asked the subjects to read words in L1, then in L2, and then to translate from L2 into L1 and from L1 into L2. Basically, the finding, or one of the findings actually, was that the cognitive facilitation effect emerged in all tasks, irrespective of the participants' level of proficiency and language pair. So we had 3 groups of Spanish-English bilinguals, a beginner group, an intermediate group, and an advanced group. And in all 3 groups, we had cognitive facilitation effects in all lexical access tasks. And then when we administered the same tasks to 2 English-Spanish bilingual groups, beginner and advanced, we had exactly the same result. So lexical processing in English is modulated by the degree of formal similarity with another language, regardless of whether the former is a non-native or a native language. So a bilingual brain processing in one language in a bilingual brain will be subject to influences from what happens in the other language, regardless of whether you're discussing a native or a non-native language. And this is the final study I want to discuss today, a very elegant study by Thierry and Wu in 2007. They formed a group of Chinese-English bilinguals, and they asked them to read and listen to pairs of English words so as to decide whether they were semantically related. So basically in the task, you had congruent pairs, semantically related pairs, such as, I don't know, guitar, violin, and semantically unrelated pairs, such as wall, sky. Now, the task was conducted entirely in English. There was no Chinese involvement. But the subjects were not aware of one empirical manipulation, which was critical. The Chinese equivalents, the tacit Chinese equivalents of some pairs had a repeated character. So for example, the pair train and ham in English was semantically unrelated. Now, what the subjects were not made explicitly aware of was the fact that the Chinese equivalents of those words, please excuse my pronunciation here, but huo she and huo tui, that's probably not even close to it, but they had a repeated character, huo, here. What happened with this? The hidden factor did not affect behavioral performance. It did not affect the speed at which the words were recognized, but it significantly modulated brain potentials by reducing the amplitude of the N400 component. That is to say, whether the word that you're using in English has a greater or a lesser degree of formal similarity with information of the language that is not active at the time of processing also has an impact on the way in which your brain will treat that information. Implicit neurocognitive processing of a non-native world language is sensitive to covert L1 specific structural features. So, as a summary of what I showed you today, these are the conclusions that I dare entertain. Grammar is processed procedurally in native speakers as well as early and or high proficiency non-native users. However, grammar in one and the same world language, English in our case, is processed declaratively in late and or low proficiency speakers, non-native speakers. Also, we have seen that bilinguals, as compared to monolinguals, have poorer vocabulary, but better executive skills. And also, non-native speakers represent English information in more widely distributed neural networks relative to monolinguals, which means that they engage additional cognitive resources to processing the same types of units. L2 lexical access is faster for high than low proficiency non-native users, especially if their L1 and L2 share formal features. And if both languages are formally dissimilar, late learners will tend to process L2 information using L1 related neural mechanisms, even if these differ from the ones typically used by native speakers. Now, by way of discussion here, I want to touch very briefly on 3 points, which is this use of neurocognitive evidence was certainly different from what you might expect in this symposium, and certainly different from the other fascinating perspectives that the other speakers have been using to construct their presentations. So the question perhaps might be, why even consider a neurocognitive perspective in the study of world languages? Well, I have 3 reasons that I would like to mention. First, there are epistemological reasons, I believe. And as it happens, world languages are multi-level phenomena. That is to say, they are very complex phenomena which involve multiple dimensions. And you cannot tell the whole story of a multi-level phenomenon by relying on just one perspective or by excluding certain perspectives from their study. So maybe you're interested in the institutional, social, and dialectal aspects, so perhaps you might adopt an interaction-oriented approach. Or maybe you are concerned with the structural and functional aspects, and perhaps you are going to have a more form-oriented approach to the study of world languages. But there is no reason why the neurological and cognitive mechanisms of world languages should be the underdog here. So I am calling here for, let's say, interdisciplinarity equality, as it were. Also, there are methodological reasons, because neurocognitive findings may provide insights for research design and data interpretation, even in studies that are not designed to explore the brain. So picture, for example, a study that examines proficiency test performance in a multicultural classroom. And let us assume that that study reveals different patterns of error between Chinese and Latin American learners of English. Let us further assume that only the Chinese learners are observed to make errors in their use of inflectional morphology in nouns and verbs. Now, there are many reasons that may account for this, but perhaps one of the reasons is that, as we have seen in the Young and colleagues study, their brain treats that linguistic information in a certain way because of the influence of their mother tongue. So I'm not saying here that neurological evidence is better than other types of evidence, far from it, but it is not less desirable than any other type of evidence. And finally, there may be some practical benefits to the use of neurocognitive evidence in studying world languages. I believe that, in particular, we can use this type of evidence to develop and improve world language teaching resources. And this is actually the meat and bone of the incipient field of neuroeducation, a field that, by the way, has its first international journal. It was launched last year. And an early precursor of this trend was Lamandela, who back in 1979 relied on a physiological evidence. Michael, I see you nodding. Yeah. He relied on a physiological evidence to specify the benefits and limitations of drilling exercises in the foreign language classroom. More recently, Neton and Germain, in 2012, they developed a cognitive neuroscience approach to foreign language teaching rooted in 5 neurolinguistic principles, and they managed to implement it in 2 universities in Canada. And I myself drew on neurolinguistic evidence to expose the theoretical contradictions of the EFL curricula in the Buenos Aires high school system, and I am now trying to enter into the political institutional arena to see whether we can actually use this evidence and these arguments to change some political documents that I believe are proving to be quite pernicious to the teaching and learning of English as a foreign language in Argentina. So the take-home message is that I believe that the study of inter-user performance variability in world languages, and of world languages in general, may well benefit from the findings of cognitive neuroscience. But we have so many questions left open. And there are three that I want to just throw out to you. The first question would be, can we link systemic functional theory to neurolinguistic evidence? Is there any avenue of interaction between these findings that I presented and the theoretical concerns of systemic functional linguistics? If this is possible, how can we do that? Can we rely on existing evidence? Should we produce our own empirical studies to try to test specific hypotheses? And which of the many questions that are of interest to systemic functional linguistics can actually be properly tackled by reference to neurocognitive evidence? Certainly not all of them, but which of them? That's another critical point. There are some preliminary attempts in this direction. Professor Sidney Lamb, in his relational network theory, has explored perhaps very generally some possible links. Robin Melrose, I was actually sharing this information with Professor Halliday yesterday, has two papers, at least that I am aware of, where he tries to rely on neurological evidence to try to test the neurocognitive plausibility of certain key constructs in systemic functional linguistics. And there are new queries. Professor Fawcett just yesterday was telling me that he is interested perhaps in developing empirical paradigms that might allow for concrete cognitive and perhaps neurocognitive testing of some specific hypotheses of the Cardiff grammar. So we have many challenges ahead of us. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much. And we have about 7 minutes for questions.
Do you mind if I stand up? It's just back to people, makes me feel uncomfortable. Thank you for that revelation of wonderful evidence. And just to chime in on the questions you asked, I'd like to suggest that a lot of the connection is already in place, but the only point I disagreed with in that beautiful presentation was the slight assumption that it hasn't already come into the picture. And so, for instance, I wonder if you've seen, in relation to, say, the Posner and Rushley development of brain imaging, of course, suddenly the generative hypothesis of highly localized syntactic organ became untenable. You've got 60 to 30 regions lighting up when someone's trying to convert a hammer from a noun to a verb. Sorry, that's the point. And so we knew that the localization idea had to be modified. And you've done this beautiful mapping. I would suggest, however, that there is a thesis that is very congruent with systemic functional linguistics that comes out of neuroscience, and that's Elkonen Goldberg. You might be familiar with his work. He's a leading researcher. He studied with Luria and escaped Russian influence, went to America. Now, his view of the two hemispheres of the brain, he first put it forward in 1974 as a result of seeing brain damage to children in Russia, talking to surgeons there. If the right hemisphere in a child was damaged, the child had a catastrophic life, even though we think of children having very plastic brains. If the left hemisphere were damaged for an adult, you get that same catastrophe. And the thesis then is that the right hemisphere, which is different on the basis of its chemistry, its morphology, and its cellular structure, actually handles novelty and passes it over to the left hemisphere, which handles formulation. Now, everything you presented so beautifully today is reconciled by that approach, which we can discuss when others have had a chance. But just one point about it, Goldberg's elaborated this in 2 volumes on the executive brain and the new executive brain in the last 7 years. And the critical issue for us, anybody in functional linguistics, is the fact if you go right back to Shklovsky, talking about what is the device in literature. What's the effect of literature? What does it contribute? And of course, it all reconciles with this idea, and so does every experiment you presented, and every piece of finding is easily reconciled with beautifully reconciled with the idea that the new patterns of living are passed over when they're perfected to the left hemisphere dominant, and that includes language, but is not just language. So, for instance, if you're not good at music, you handle it in the right hemisphere. People say, oh, musicians, and that's not true. If you're a master of music, you'll find that it's treated like the grammar. Later on, it's laid down as patterns in the left. So why I've taken so long is because I'm so excited about what you presented. And what I'd like to suggest to you, through construing experience, through meaning, and various other articles, and particularly contact with Russian psychology, the functional linguistic approach has been pushing very hard on how to reconcile the approach, particularly the textual metafunction, which ties in with what you said about late interventions, an L2 learner later on. Well, see, you didn't distinguish metafunction or strata. So a lot of these tests, for me, is a child really good at accent and some formulas, formulate parts of the grammar, but are the L2 learners later, is that declarative really working in what's peculiarly human? Chimps are very good at communication, but then they have no evidence of textual metafunction, humans intervening. I apologise that my discussion is putting a piece of information to you that has taken up some of the question time, but it's just because I'm so excited by what you've done, and I'm very excited by how well it can be reconciled with interests that we've already committed ourselves to, and I hope we get a lot of chance to elaborate both sides.
I really appreciate your comments, and perhaps we can discuss all these very, very fascinating notions after we're done here. Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much for that. And as you know, I have no problem in accepting that neuro-linguistic, or if you prefer, neurocognitive approach is relevant to everything that we're doing and what we're interested in, no problem. I've been working on and off with Sidney Lamb since the 1960s anyway, so I'm very, very familiar with his work. I have one particular issue in a way which concerns the sort of modeling of language which underlies much of the researches that you've talked about. A very simple point first. Certain features seem to be clearly phonological, which you have treated as lexical. That's points like, for example, Chinese problems with morphology relate more, I think, to Chinese syllable structure than that kind of thing. But much more seriously is that it seems to draw a line, a sharp line between lexis and grammar, as if they were phenomenologically distinct. Well, they're not, I think, and I think it's now generally accepted even in mainstream linguistics, which has been very slow to realize this. And we have always maintained in our work that grammar and lexis represent a single stratum of linguistic organization. Now, the point is that the work that has been done seems to me, from what I know of it, to contrast, as it were, the two ends of the continuum. The lexical end clearly lexicalized meanings, the grammatical end clearly grammaticalized ones. Now, and that is partly shown in the labeling that you use, lexicosemantic and grammatical, but why not grammaticosemantic? Grammar is just as meaning-making as the lexis. Now, the point is that a lot of meanings are made sort of in a middle range across the lexico-grammatical continuum. I mean, all stuff that Jim Martin does under the heading of a present, for example, which you can't parcel out very clearly. So I think it seems to me that we need, in a sense, to feed back and to say, all right, but let's see what the actual linguistic model that is being, so to speak, presupposed in a lot of this work, how this may need, in some sense, rethinking in the light of more recent work in linguistics, for example, including our own. I'll leave other questions for now, but...
Oh, no, but absolutely, Michael. And the thing is, this is a very interesting point, because I believe that what you have hinted at here is what the contributions, I mean, let's change the causal connection here, what the contributions of systemic functional linguistics can be for neurolinguistics. All these experiments are not theory independent. they are not constructed in a theoretical vacuum. And there are theoretical assumptions that are entertained here, namely the, let's say, the abyssal distinction between grammar and lexicosemantics. First of all, of course, from a systemic functional standpoint, lexics is one thing, semantics is another thing. They belong to different strata, and there is a lexicogrammatical continuum. Now, if we are interested in exploring that, and perhaps in bringing the assumptions of that notion of the lexicogrammatical continuum so as to subvert this discrete differentiation that certainly underlies all the studies that I set forth here, what we need to do is actually to try to find a way for systemic functional linguistics to creep into neurolinguistic research, which is something that hasn't happened yet.
No.
None of these studies, at least that I am aware of.
To phraseology, for example.
Right. Well, yes, I know some studies in clinical linguistics too. But I myself know of no experimental design with neuroimages, for example, that are based on a systemic functional approach. And I believe this is one of the things that I wanted to leave open here. That might be very exciting. And we are now, brain research is blooming. So perhaps we should start working, Professor Foster David, to try to foster that link somehow. So yes, there are some problems here, Professor Hallier, for sure. And I believe that what you highlighted here is one of the main avenues for interaction and progress, interdisciplinary progress. So thank you for your comment.
There's a lot to go on here, but I think we'll have to stop there because everybody will be gasping for coffee. So again, thank you for Professor García.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're a wonderful new component of all of this effort. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Lovely
Thank you,
presentation.
Please, let's discuss all those
yeah.
things.
I've got to give a talk now too.
Sure.
Sorry.
David has done a lot with Sid Lamb as well.
Well, I heard Parody and Sid Lamb debate in Canada, and also a couple of others. Like I know Robin Melrose very well. He actually did some work on some work of mine. So
I hope it's really good for you.
We should. I've been working with Sid since 2009.
Yeah. Oh, he's a lovely person. I just wish I had the money to bring him out to Australia. That's been a struggle.
Right.
Is this yours or is that the standard computer?
Oh no, this is mine. Let me just clear the way for it.
I've got that.
Adolfo, thank you very much.
Oh, Jennifer,
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, as well, the whole thing of Lexis means with priming studies, how can you say Lexis is declarative knowledge? Because don't white priming studies suggest that it's subconscious as well?
We have to differentiate. Okay, that's a very good point. What is the representation of lexical information access to lexical information? Those are two distinct processes. We should
Hello.
Oh, nice PowerPoint.
This one's a special one by Annabelle's done. But,
I see.
David, see you in a minute.
So, do you have more tea?
No, I'm right, thanks. I've got some water somewhere. Yeah, just there.
You're all set, David.
But
Are you
pretty
all
much,
set?
I think.
I'm
Just,
going to move, or will you sit here?
yeah.
So I can be. I think you go back to the time control. I've got. I'll show you that 10 minutes. They're very. They move about 5 minutes.
So, will you?
Yeah, I will go from. From one to start. I watch this time. I'll try and get to the back in there.
No,
But I think
well, it's up to you.
set my watch. Well, I'll do it by my watch this time. Get it right. Well, no, I'm not. Ready? Steady?
This won't respond. I'm just wondering whether you can pull it because I won't be this one's going to pull through. This one will and then get back to the slideshow. So I was just wondering, I'll show you what it is. See, so I thought, well, normally when I use this Prezi, I can just click.
Is it a PowerPoint?
No, it's a Prezi. It's a special kind of. It's a special kind of thing. So what I have to do? I found
Your PowerPoint works, right? It works with a clicker, right?
see, and then I can get this, but I've got to. Then when I want to go on a bit, I've got to do this all the time. You know.
So what is it you want
to there. So what I'd like you to do is take it slowly through while I'm talking it through. So then it comes, so if you click on here, you get, okay, I get back to start. But if I fiddle around with, I need to just quickly explain it and then drop it and come back to the slideshow. So would it be possible?
I've never used this before. So
no, that's all right. But if you don't mind clicking it on, so you know we'll start off like that, and then if you
go for this one.
click and then, or you know, it should go. You've got to go like this. I don't know. It's gone bit crazy. I'll go back to the start. What I want to do is just click through. It goes here, there, 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 kind of thing. So it's just clicking and pushing it on.
Okay.
Yeah.
This one. This one. But they have to go back, right?
No, then I have to go. Then it has to go to the next one.
How to go to the next one?
Yeah. Well, I had to click that.
Oh.
Then it takes you back to that. No, I need to keep going on. So it's this one
I know.
here. Yeah. So the amount of fiddling I have to do means it's.
Is it like you have actually set the how it goes? If you have already set how it goes, I can just like that to start. So if I click this one, we'll go to this one.
Yeah.
Here, go to this one,
Yeah.
and then this one.
Yeah.
So I only have to press this.
Okay. Oh, good.
Is it right?
Yeah, that's it. I was trying to press 2. That's why I think I must have been sending it into crazy.
Like this.
Yeah. Do you mind just delivering that over, because I just only want to spend about 5 minutes on it and then get back to, and then if you could click onto the PowerPoint, and then I'll
Click onto the PowerPoint, I have to go out, right?
well, yeah, and I'll be talking while I'm
Go back to the PowerPoint. Okay.
so
This is full screen. Go back to start.
if you didn't mind, it just means that I won't have to.
No, I just have to click on the arrow,
Okay.
right?
Yep, looks like it. You're the one who discovered that. I was clicking on this and this together, and I think that must have been interrupting it because I